certainly a dangerous team, which I think that at least around here we sort of agreed on before the season anyway. And I picked Alabama to beat Clemson.
Other than the Florida game, which we've already talked about, I saw six other games that should be watched by America. It's really a poor week in college football. There's not a lot of games this week that are very, very intriguing.
What
That should
about
be a
San Diego
thriller,
State and Notre Dame?
right down to the wire. San Diego State lost last week to Cal Poly.
Notre Dame lost a lot of those kind of games last year. Their schedule's built to have 6 or 7 wins every year, and they only got three. But I just
First
think
game
most
is
people don't realize how
this
pathetic they really
Thursday
were
night.
last year.
It's I guess the first SEC game of the season. We have South Carolina versus Vanderbilt at Vanderbilt. Vandy looked pretty good last week, and so did South Carolina. South Carolina came out strong last week. It's at Vandy. I really don't think that there's going to be a big to do if South Carolina wins. I think everybody will probably think the same thing as I do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I expect South Carolina to win, especially that they're starting Smelly at quarterback this year. I don't know what he did that Spurrier kept him off the field for so long, but once South Carolina has any kind of offense, and they didn't have any that much offense last year, at least passing, or last week, if they put together anything, they should be able to win this game pretty easily. I'd think. Vanderbilt looked pretty good last week, but
Two teams coming off pretty good seasons last year. Boston College got a win last week. It's at Boston College. I think Boston College wins this by 10 or so.
yeah, I picked Boston College as well. Georgia Tech, second game, the first real game, I think, in the new, at least the first conference game in the new system on the road. I think it'll be a tough game for them. However, I do think Paul Johnson's a good coach. I had to go with the home team. I mean, it's intriguing in that it's a conference game and it should be pretty evenly matched, but it's not at all like we're going to
Yeah,
see next
absolutely.
week.
Cincinnati versus Oklahoma. Oklahoma looked awesome in the first half. They had over 50 points in the first half. But they're playing a Cincinnati team that was really, really scrappy last year and gave some teams some really, really great games. Brian Kelly knows what he's doing. I expect that to be a lot closer than people think. Cincinnati has some talent on the field. Yes, it's at Oklahoma. Yes, Oklahoma should win this game because they have more talent. They have a really good coach. It's at home. But I think that Cincinnati will probably scare them a little bit, and it should be pretty, pretty close.
Do you have the line on that game? Yeah,
The
that's a
line is
pretty big line.
21 points. It's a little large, you know.
Yeah, that kind of line that large, I'd be tempted to take it also. If this was a
Hook
bowl
and
game, I'd
lateral.
probably
How
take
about that one?
Cincinnati to outright
Um,
win.
Oregon State versus Penn State. Oregon State had a really bad loss last week at Stanford. I don't know. Oregon State last year they had a couple of good wins, and I don't know what to think. Penn State looked great. They had I think they won 66-10 last week against probably another one of those directional schools. I forgot who they played, but they looked good. It's at Penn State. I expect Penn State to win this game pretty handily.
Is Coastal a direction? Because it's Coastal Carolina. But yeah, I didn't get to see Penn State. I don't know too much about them. I know a lot of so-called experts are high on them, but I don't know if that's just because they're Penn State and 3 or 4 or 5 Big Ten schools are going to get hype whether they deserve it or not. But it's on the road. It'll be tough for Oregon State considering they just lost to Stanford. So I see no reason to pick against Penn State as much as it's the kind of upset
Uh,
I'd usually like to call. Except,
you got to think that this is might be the biggest game because unless the Miami Florida game turns out to be closer than we think, but I think that this might be one of the most intriguing matchups of the week. West Virginia at East Carolina. East Carolina, of course, last week beat Virginia Tech at home, or at East Carolina, excuse me, and they looked good. They blocked a kick at late in the game, scored a touchdown, and they beat the Hokies, who always seem to be in the hunt. So it's a really intriguing matchup. West Virginia now doesn't have their coach. They lost Steve Slayton. They do have Noel Devine. That kid is going to be ridiculous. But I think that West Virginia wins this game. They should. They've got the talent. They still have a lot of those pieces from that old regime. I got to think that West Virginia takes this one, but it's probably going to be pretty close.
It could be. I mean, certainly with what we saw last week, I'm fairly confident in West Virginia just because I think if East Carolina loses that game last week, maybe West Virginia doesn't get their attention, but they've got their attention now, and they're not going to be looking past this opponent. And so I think that they'll come in and be really good. I think West Virginia is really good. They're not going to miss much from last year and losing the coach because it's just the first year after. It could be, how much did Miami lose when Larry Coker came in his first year compared to his last year? Regardless of how it's going to turn out in West Virginia over the years, this year they should be good to go, and they're clearly the better team. And they're not shuffling quarterbacks. They know who their guy is. They know what kind of team they are. Whereas that Virginia Tech team kind of didn't have that. They're always in the hunt and that sort of thing, but they didn't have the same team identity that West Virginia has. And maybe they were even looking past the team a little bit, whereas West Virginia is going to be fired up and ready to go. I was going to talk about Idaho State and Idaho,
Yeah,
the interstate rivalry.
Idaho's kind of shaped like an H.
But I don't know anything except for Idaho's the Vandals, right?
And also, they have potatoes there. And Napoleon Dynamite. So, yeah, that should be a good game, too. So, we'll move to the last game of the week. And it's the second marquee matchup in the state of Florida. And it's the number 19 South Florida Bulls versus the Central Florida Golden Knights, excuse me. Two teams that had a very, very good season last year. Surprised a lot of people. South Florida at one point was number 2 in the country. I don't think that they're going to be anywhere close as high as they were last year, but they're going to be up there. They're playing in a weaker Big East. They should get some wins. This UCF team, they lost their main running back in Kevin Smith, but George O'Leary knows what he's doing. He seems to have a good track record in anywhere that he goes except for Notre Dame. And I don't know. I think that he'll figure it out, and he'll get them back on winning. I don't know about this year, but I think that South Florida wins this game. It's at UCF. It's only an hour and a half drive between the two schools, if that, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. You're gonna have this is probably their biggest rivalry between these two schools, and hopefully I'd like to see it get a lot bigger over the next couple of years. But I think the South Florida wins this game handily. James?
Yeah, I picked South Florida as well. I think that in addition to losing Kevin Smith, UCF also lost their quarterback. South Florida is clearly a much better team. I don't know that UCF can be said to have an enormous home field advantage. It's not some crazy ESPN night game where South Florida, at least for one night, had a home field advantage last year. Yeah, USF wins, I think. Although maybe it's a more interesting game down the line, but this year you got to take South Florida. I did see an upset in the night games. I'm actually picking Louisiana Monroe to beat Arkansas. And I don't know your opinion on that. Arkansas looked pretty bad and almost
The
lost
same
last
Louisiana
week.
Monroe that beat
And this is
Alabama
playing
last
Louisiana
year, is that
Monroe
right?
on the road. Yes, but also the same Louisiana Monroe that got shut out by Auburn last week. But Auburn's pretty good. So I went back and forth, and I went for it because we do our picks thing, and all the picks were so boring. I picked Louisiana Monroe to win this game because I really don't know what to think of Arkansas because they looked really bad last week.
I think
and they have
Arkansas
their new
wins
coach,
that
and maybe
game.
it'll take them a while to figure it
Come
out.
on.
I picked James Madison to beat Duke last week. Houston and Oklahoma State was another one that Oklahoma State should be pretty good. So I don't think it's that much of a problem. But Houston's gone to bowl games recently, and I don't know what kind of team they have. But that was another one that I
don't know, I
thought,
think-
well, maybe if you were really looking for an upset and it was
And if you're drinking heavily,
depending on what the spread is, if you got the spread, maybe you could pick that game. But I picked Oklahoma State. Yeah, and if you were, prone to taking bad gambles, at least that's one you could talk yourself into.
All right, tune in to next week's podcast. We have a bye week next week before going to Tennessee.
Yeah, but it's a
USC
huge week
next week
for
in LA.
a lot of good games.
They're pretty big games, so look for another game. Look for another podcast next week. Also, look for podcasts coming soon for the NFL preview. We'll be talking about the Dolphins, the Jaguars, and the Bucks here in the state of Florida, and maybe a couple other teams like James's Pats, who I loathe. All right, so for James Brown, this is Chris Canada. I'm signing off. Take care.